à la longue liste des crimes de guerre dont la Russie devra rendre compte. Comme elle le fait depuis près de 2 ans, avec des frappes massives contre les infrastructures énergétiques du pays, elle cible des objectifs civils et cherche à saper la résilience du peuple ukrainien. La France réaffirme son soutien aux travaux menés par les Nations Unies et d'autres organisations pour documenter ces violations et assurer une reddition des comptes. Ces actes s'ajoutent au transfert forcé d'enfants ukrainiens. Toutes ces violences graves commises contre les enfants ont justifié, cette année encore, l'inscription de la Russie sur la liste d'infamie du rapport annuel sur les enfants dans les conflits armés. Ces faits viennent confirmer une nouvelle fois que notre soutien à l'Ukraine doit se poursuivre et s'amplifier. Comme l'a rappelé le Conseil européen du 27 juin dernier, la Russie ne peut ni ne doit gagner cette guerre. La France continuera donc à fournir à l'Ukraine le soutien nécessaire à sa légitime défense aussi longtemps qu'il le faudra. Elle poursuivra son aide humanitaire à l'Ukraine. Elle a mobilisé 300 millions d'euros en 2022 et 2023. En 2024, la France fournira plus de 100 millions d'euros dans les secteurs de la santé, de l'éducation, du déminage, de l'énergie et de l'eau. Nous appelons à nouveau la Russie à retirer ses troupes du territoire ukrainien, comme l'a demandé la Cour internationale de justice dès le 16 mars 2022. Nous resterons mobilisés pour faire respecter les principes de la Charte des Nations Unies et condamnerons sans relâche leurs violations. Je vous remercie.
Я благодарю Францию за их заявление и сейчас предоставляю слово Эквадору.
Gracias, señor presidente. Quiero agradecer a la señora Joyce Msuya, secretaria general adjunta en funciones, por su exposición informativa. Escuché con atención al señor Shavnir. Reconozco la presencia en esta Cámara de los representantes de Ucrania, Polonia y de la Unión Europea. El Ecuador observa con profunda preocupación la reciente intensificación de las hostilidades en Ucrania, que ha causado numerosas muertes y heridos, afectando además edificios residenciales y comerciales en varias ciudades. Es particularmente intolerable la destrucción del hospital infantil Okhmatdyt en Kiev, que tal como hemos escuchado, ha dejado un saldo de víctimas civiles inocentes, incluidos niños y mujeres. Las unidades sanitarias, como hospitales y otras infraestructuras creadas con fines de atención médicas, deben ser respetadas y protegidas en todas las circunstancias y por todas las partes en conflicto. Esperamos que este hecho sea debidamente investigado para que no quede en la impunidad. Las impactantes imágenes que detallan el sufrimiento causado por estos ataques, así como aquellas de hace pocas semanas que muestran el pánico de los civiles que disfrutaban pacíficamente en una playa en Crimea ocupada, evidencian la tragedia humana que se desarrolla ante nuestros ojos a causa de este conflicto. El Ecuador reitera su llamado a todas las partes a respetar el derecho internacional humanitario, observando especialmente los principios de distinción, proporcionalidad y precaución, pues es imperativo proteger la vida de los civiles y resguardar las infraestructuras civiles. Quisiera recordar que el secretario general, haciendo eco del que considera un llamado generalizado a la comunidad internacional, ha instado de manera sistemática a las partes a que se abstengan de utilizar armas explosivas en zonas pobladas, ya que su utilización puede causar daños directos, indiscriminados y de largo plazo. Por esto, los combates deben alejarse totalmente de las zonas urbanas. Señor presidente, este conflicto constituye una tragedia para los pueblos de Rusia y Ucrania y por lo tanto debe terminar. Resulta desalentador que, a pesar de los esfuerzos e iniciativas por buscar la paz, las hostilidades se intensifiquen y sean los civiles quienes continúen pagando el precio más alto. Debemos pasar de la lógica de dominación y de la fuerza a la lógica de la diplomacia y la solución pacífica de las controversias. El Ecuador cree firmemente en una solución pacífica al conflicto, a través de la negociación y la vía diplomática, fundamentada en el respeto a la soberanía e integridad territorial de Ucrania y enmarcada en el derecho internacional y la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Me uno al llamado para que la Federación Rusa retire sus tropas del territorio ocupado, así como al clamor de la comunidad internacional para que esta guerra no dure un día más. Muchas gracias.
Я благодарю Эквадор за их заявление и сейчас предоставляю слово Швейцарии.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et je voudrais aussi remercier la secrétaire générale adjointe aux affaires humanitaires ad interim, Joyce Misuya, ainsi que le docteur Tsovnir pour leurs interventions. Et je salue également la participation des collègues de l'Ukraine, de l'Union européenne et de la Pologne. Monsieur le Président, nous sommes choqués qu'un hôpital pour enfants, où beaucoup souffrent de maladies graves et se trouvent dans des conditions de vulnérabilité extrême, a été touché par une frappe de la Russie. Et nous l'avons entendu, des tirs de missiles à travers l'Ukraine ont fait des morts et des blessés en frappant des infrastructures civiles à Kiev, Dnipro, Kryvyi, Pokrovsk, Sloviansk et Kramatorsk. Ces frappes auraient tué des dizaines de civils et touché le plus grand hôpital pour enfants de Kiev, ainsi qu'un autre établissement médical dans la capitale. Et je voudrais exprimer nos profondes condoléances à toutes les familles, aux victimes, aux blessés et tous ceux touchés, aux docteurs touchés par ces frappes terribles. Encore une fois, des enfants sont devenus les victimes de l'agression militaire russe qui continue depuis 2 ans et 5 mois. Nous condamnons fermement ces attaques. La population civile et les infrastructures civiles ne doivent pas être prises pour cible. Le droit international, en particulier les droits humains et le droit international humanitaire, doit être strictement respecté en toutes circonstances. Et nous appelons la Russie à s'y conformer et à protéger la population et les infrastructures civiles. En vertu du droit international humanitaire, les hôpitaux bénéficient d'une protection spécifique. L'horreur à laquelle les enfants et leurs familles doivent faire face depuis le début de la guerre en Ukraine ne semble pas près de diminuer. En 2023, les Nations Unies ont attribué aux forces armées russes et aux groupes armés affiliés 249 attaques contre des écoles et des hôpitaux, y compris à l'encontre de personnes protégées. Au cours des 2 dernières années, près de 2000 enfants auraient été tués ou blessés. Au lieu d'aller à l'école, les enfants des villes situées sur les lignes de front de l'Ukraine ont été contraints de passer entre 3000 et 5000 heures à s'abriter dans des sous-sols et des stations de métro, soit entre 4 et 7 mois. Alors que l'Ukraine se bat pour son avenir en paix, ceux qui le construiront, notamment les enfants, doivent avoir la garantie d'être protégés. Le droit international humanitaire prévoit une protection spéciale pour les enfants. En outre, un membre du personnel de santé aurait également été tué par la frappe de hier. Là aussi, le droit international humanitaire est absolument clair. Protéger le personnel humanitaire, y compris médical, est une obligation. Ceux qui risquent leur vie pour aider les autres doivent être protégés. Monsieur le Président, aucun enfant ne devrait grandir sous la menace d'un tir de missile. Aucun enfant ne devrait trouver la mort dans les décombres d'un hôpital, censé être un lieu sûr de guérison et de rétablissement. Chaque enfant devrait avoir la possibilité de mener une vie sereine et sécurisée et retrouver une existence normale. Pour que cela soit possible, la Russie doit mettre fin à son agression militaire contre l'Ukraine, cesser toutes les hostilités et retirer ses troupes de l'ensemble du territoire ukrainien. La Charte nous engage toutes et tous à respecter la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de tous les États. La Suisse reste déterminée à faire tout ce qui est en son pouvoir pour contribuer à une paix juste et durable en Ukraine, conformément à cette même Charte des Nations Unies et les principes fondamentaux du droit international. C'est dans cet esprit que le 15 et 16 juin dernier, des représentantes et représentants de plus de 100 pays du monde entier et d'organisations internationales se sont réunis en Suisse pour discuter d'un cadre pour un processus de paix basé sur le droit international et notamment la Charte des Nations Unies, dans le but d'inspirer des mesures concrètes en faveur d'une paix juste et durable en Ukraine. Et nous allons continuer cet engagement. Je vous remercie.
Я благодарю Швейцарию за их заявление. Сейчас предоставляю слово Словении.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to thank both briefers, Ms. Misiuna and Dr. Zhovnir for their contribution, and I welcome participation of the Ukraine, European Union and Poland. Mr. President, we are appalled by the latest airstrikes on Ukraine by the country that you are representing. While we fail to understand the reason for this war, we are convinced that there is absolutely nothing that can justify the brutal attacks on critical civilian infrastructure. Nothing justifies systemic attacks on medical facilities. Yesterday, another low in this war of aggression was reached, with a direct missile strike at the Okhmatdyt hospital, one of Europe's largest children's hospitals. As if this were not enough, the follow-up strike wrecked a maternity hospital in the vicinity. We are again seeing the full spectrum of horror this war has brought, this time around with children and their parents at its center. It is indeed beyond the limits of humanity, as Dr. Zhovnir just described his feelings. In response to Russia's claims that the responsibility for this devastation should be put on air defense systems, we would like to clarify. Independent sources are disproving these claims. We deplore Russian missile strikes, and we reject the lack of responsibility that Russia is showing in relation to them. Mr. President, the Council should not lose sight of the full picture of the destruction this war has brought. Yesterday's horrid missile attack is just the tip of the iceberg. WHO has verified that from April to May this year, more than one-third of attacks against healthcare facilities happened in Ukraine. In parallel, the healthcare needs have been increasing. In 2024, the civilian casualties have been continuously on the rise, with each month demanding a greater death toll. Additionally, only in May, the new offensive around the city of Kharkiv caused the largest displacement in Ukraine since 2023. Mr. President, killing and maiming children and attacks against hospitals are grave violations against children in armed conflicts. Deliberate targeting of critical civilian infrastructure is prohibited by the international humanitarian law. Rejecting responsibility equals endorsing impunity. This Council is entrusted by the Charter to address and prevent all of the above. Too many fathers and mothers have been killed. Too many children have been deprived of the future. Too many homes and schools have been reduced to rubble. And too many hospitals have stopped providing life-saving services. We have seen enough death and destruction for a lifetime. No amount of our support, physical or psychological rehabilitation, or assistance to the health and emergency services can alleviate all this suffering. So, Mr. President, please stop this war. It has been going on for too long.
Я благодарю представителя Словении за его заявление. Сейчас предоставляю слово Республике Корея.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Acting USG Joyce Msuya and Mr. Zhovnir for their timely and informative briefings. We have gathered in this chamber to discuss the war in Ukraine on many previous occasions, but today's session feels different. Where to begin after seeing the unimaginably horrific scenes of children and infants being attacked in the hospital beds? How did we get here? While we are well aware that civilian casualties are a tragic but inevitable consequence of war, we would still like to believe that there are certain lines people will not cross. From the outset, the Russian Federation has tried to justify its invasion into Ukraine's sovereign territory as a defensive action, but few believe this. Its repeated, deliberate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure throughout the conflict are indefensible. This latest offensive by Russia against the civilian targets across Ukraine was especially brazen, causing scores of casualties and serious damage to civilian infrastructure. Most notably, the missile strike against the Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital in Kyiv, where my President Yoon Suk-yeol and the First Lady visited in July 2023 to comfort the children and their families receiving treatment. This is a new law. An attack against the most vulnerable among us betrays a basic lack of humanity. Russia's ongoing indiscriminate attacks against civilian objects across Ukraine is a flagrant violation of international law, including international humanitarian law, and those responsible for such heinous acts must be held accountable. At the same time, our hearts go out to all the victims. Colleagues, we once again reiterate that Russia's armed invasion of Ukraine and its annexation of Ukrainian territories through the use of force are serious violations of the UN Charter and international law, and run counter to the core values underpinning the international system. In this respect, I'd like to remind you all that only a handful of countries, such as North Korea, have recognized the unlawful annexation of Ukrainian land by Russia. The overwhelming majority of UN member states still strongly believe that those regions are an integral part of sovereign Ukraine state. The longer this war continues, the greater number of lives will suffer miserably and the greater likelihood for further regional instability. Therefore, the only way forward is to work diligently towards an early end to the war. In this regard, my delegation once again stresses that all the devastating events and the human suffering transpiring in Ukraine are a result of Russia's illegal invasion. This must end now without preconditions. The Republic of Korea will continue to stand with the people of Ukraine and provide vital assistance in the areas of security, humanitarian aid, and reconstruction until they achieve just and lasting peace in their land. I thank you.
Я благодарю Республику Корея за их заявление. Сейчас предоставляю слово Китаю.
主席，我感谢穆苏雅代理副秘书长的通报。我也认真听取了若夫尼尔先生的发言。乌克兰危机自2022年2月全面升级以来，持续冲突已经导致大量无辜平民伤亡，大量基础设施损毁，引发了严重的人道危机，产生了巨大的外溢效应。中方对此深表忧虑。近来，战争不但没有停止，反而愈演愈烈，并不时发生恶性袭击事件，造成严重人员伤亡。我们对此深表关切，在此呼吁冲突当事方保持理性克制，切实遵守国际人道法，避免袭击平民和民用基础设施。冲突对抗没有赢家，军事手段带不来持久和平。中国国家主席习近平近日在会见访华的外国领导人时指出，早日停火止战，寻求政治解决，符合各方利益。当前的重点是遵守战场不外溢、战事不升级、各方不拱火3原则，尽快推动局势降温。国际社会要为双方恢复直接对话谈判创造条件，提供助力。只有所有大国都发挥正能量，而不是负能量，这场冲突才能尽早出现停火的曙光。在乌克兰问题上，中方始终主张，各国主权、领土完整都应该得到尊重，联合国宪章宗旨和原则都应该得到遵守，各国合理安全关切都应该得到重视，一切有利于和平解决危机的努力都应该得到支持。我们呼吁冲突当事方展现政治意愿，相向而行，早日开启和谈。呼吁国际社会本着客观公正立场，为早日结束战争营造有利条件，发挥积极作用。呼吁有关各方共同努力， 秉持共同、综合、合作、可持续的安全观，推动建立均衡、有效、可持续的欧洲安全架构。中方将继续以自己的方式积极劝和促谈，为推动乌克兰问题的政治解决做出不懈努力，发挥建设性作用。谢谢主席。
Я благодарю Китай за их заявление и предоставляю слово Сьерра-Леоне.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Acting USG Ms. Joyce Musea for our briefing. And I take note of the sobering information provided by Mr. Vladimir Zovny. I welcome the participation of the representatives of Ukraine, Poland, and the head of the delegation of the European Union. Sierra Leone notes with deep concern the recent reported missile strikes on civilians and civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. It is reported that during a daytime attack, missiles struck multiple Ukrainian cities, killing at least 31 people, injuring about 125 others, and seriously damaging a major children's hospital. Based on report, those killed in the multiple missile strikes include doctors, patients, women and children, the very best of society, and also most vulnerable in times of armed conflict. Sierra Leone expresses deepest condolences to the victims and the families of the victims affected by the missile strikes. Sierra Leone deplores attacks on civilians, civilian and protected objects, and vital infrastructure. The report of the missile strike of the Kiev main children's hospital, resulting in the loss of innocent lives and the extensive damage to a critical healthcare facility, are truly heartbreaking and distressing. We call on all the parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international law and take immediate steps at de-escalation. We have previously reiterated in this Council that the deliberate targeting of residential or civilian areas, civilian infrastructure, and essential services, such as hospitals, school, water, and energy facilities, are unacceptable and prohibited under international law. It poses a significant threat to the safety and well-being of the most vulnerable and protected populations, violating the basic tenets of humanity and the principles of international humanitarian law. The devastating impact of these strikes on civilians, including women and children, is a stark reminder of the urgent need for the violence to end and a renewed commitment to protecting civilian lives and infrastructure in conflict zones. It also begs for independent investigations aimed at accountability. We call on all involved parties to exercise restraint and take all necessary measures to avoid further civilian casualties and damage to critical infrastructure. The protection of civilians must be paramount in any conflict, including the conflict in Ukraine. Ensuring that the parties to the conflict maintain the safety of civilians must be the utmost collective priority of this Security Council. Let me therefore close, Mr. President, by urging all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians and critical infrastructure, including hospitals, to ensure essential services for the well-being and stability of civilians. The involved parties must choose and prioritize peace. Peace is made not between friends, but between parties in a state of disagreement. Peace can also not be left to chance. Sierra Leone therefore reiterates its call for meaningful steps to be taken towards the immediate cessation of the hostilities and for constructive and inclusive diplomatic efforts to achieve a just and lasting resolution of the conflict. In taking this important step, we call for the full respect for the Ukraine's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and for the legitimate concerns of all parties to be taken into account. I thank you.
Я благодарю Сьерра-Леоне за их заявление и предоставляю слово Алжиру.
سيد الرئيس، أود في البداية أن أعرب عن شكري لوكيلة الأمين العام بالنيابة للشؤون الإنسانية ومنسقة الإغاثة في حالة الطوارئ السيدة جويس سويا على إحاطتها، كما استمعنا لإحاطة السيد فولوديمير زوفنير. تعرب الجزائر مرة أخرى عن قلقها البالغ إزاء التصعيد المستمر للتوترات الناجمة عن العمليات العسكرية في روسيا وأوكرانيا. للأسف لا يزال المدنيون هم الطرف الذي يتحمل العبء الثقيل لهذا التصعيد المستمر، كما أن الوضع الإنساني المزري هو أيضاً مصدر قلق عميق يتطلب التزاماً واضحاً من كلا الطرفين لمعالجته. ونحن نجتمع مرة أخرى لمناقشة الوضع المقلق على الميدان. لم نرى بعد للأسف أي بوادر للتهدئة. وفي ظل هذه الخلفية نود أن نشير إلى ما يلي: أولاً، من الضروري منح الأولوية اللازمة للجهود الدبلوماسية لمعالجة الأزمة الإنسانية في أوكرانيا بطريقة شاملة. لا يمكن تحقيق ذلك دون التزام واضح من جميع الأطراف بخفض التصعيد والامتثال لميثاق الأمم المتحدة والقانون الدولي، بما في ذلك القانون الدولي الإنساني. ثانياً، إن منطق المواجهة لم يكن أبداً حلاً للنزاعات. يجب أن يفسح المجال لضبط النفس والحوار والمفاوضات وفقاً لمبادئ الشمولية والتسوية السلمية للنزاعات. إن استخدام الأسلحة لا يمكن إلا أن يؤدي إلى فقدان المزيد من الأرواح، بما في ذلك بين المدنيين وخاصة الأطفال، ومعاناة السكان، وتدمير البنى التحتية، ويزيد من إعاقة احتمال التوصل إلى حلول للنزاع. تكرر الجزائر التزامها بدعم أي جهد للسلام يهدف إلى وضع أسس لحل مستدام وسلمي لهذه الأزمة. ثالثاً، إن الاستقطاب الناجم عن هذه الأزمة يشكل مصدر قلق للجزائر، حيث أنه يساهم في زيادة التصعيد مع عواقب وخيمة على السلم والأمن الدوليين، بما في ذلك الأمن الغذائي والأمن الطاقوي. لا تزال الجزائر تؤمن أن المساعي المتعددة الأطراف مع تكثيف الجهود الدبلوماسية الدولية تمثل السبيل الأنجع للتوصل إلى نتائج ملموسة حيال هذه الأزمة. هكذا جهود ستسمح بالحفاظ على الأطر الدبلوماسية والتوصل إلى تسوية سلمية طبقاً لمقاصد ومبادئ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة والانشغالات الأمنية المشروعة لجميع الأطراف. وشكراً.
Я благодарю Алжир за их заявление и предоставляю слово Мальте.
President, I would like to thank Acting USG Masuya and Mrs. Jovenir for their briefings. As has been the case for previous sessions, large-scale Russian aerial attacks continue across Ukraine, with a sustained targeting of essential infrastructures causing more death, destruction, and trauma. Yesterday, the Russian Federation launched another wave of deathly strikes across several regions in Ukraine. At least 40 long-range missiles were fired at targets across the country, killing dozens and wounding over 150. The Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital, Ukraine's largest children's hospital, and the main treatment center for the children in the country for children with cancer, was also hit during these attacks. 12 departments were damaged, and the section of Ukraine's only oncology and hematology laboratories were completely destroyed. Power, oxygen, and water supplies have been lost, and people were trapped under the rubble. The exact number of victims is still unknown. The Isida Maternity Hospital, located in Ukraine's capital, was also severely damaged due to the falling debris. The hospital counts with 27 sources of ionizing radiation and is a beneficiary of the IAEA's Technical Cooperation Program. This missile attack not only endangers lives, but also constitutes a violation of the IAEA's core principles and values. We express our condolences to the families who are enduring the unbearable loss of their loved ones and wish a speedy recovery to those injured due to these ruthless attacks across Ukraine. Health and educational facilities must always be protected to ensure uninterrupted delivery of health and education services to all people in Ukraine. Attacks on civilians and civilian objects must stop. That should be at the center of our efforts. International humanitarian and human rights law must be respected at all times. Malta condemns in the strongest possible terms these attacks. We reiterate our call to immediately cease all attacks against hospitals, residential buildings, and critical infrastructure in Ukraine, and for all parties to adhere to their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. Yesterday's events took place against the background of Russia's launch of its new military offensive in the Kharkiv region. According to the WHO, there are reports of 18 deaths and 81 injuries from more than 175 attacks on healthcare infrastructure in Ukraine for the first half of 2024. These attacks have similarly endangered the lives of thousands of children, healthcare workers, and civilians, including the already vulnerable population, not least the elderly, children, and people with disabilities. Malta reiterates that the perpetrators of these actions must be held accountable for the damage done. We express our full support to the mandate of the International Criminal Court, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, as well as to the register of damage caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, and the work on the establishment of a future compensation mechanism. In closing, Malta reiterates that the only path to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace and an end to the suffering being inflicted on innocent Ukrainians is for Russia to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Я благодарю Мальту за их заявление и предоставляю слово Мозамбику.
Mr. President, we extend our gratitude to Acting Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Acting Emergency Relief Coordinator, Joyce Msuya, for our information. We took note to the briefing by Mr. Volodymyr. We recognize the presence of the representatives of Ukraine, Poland, and the delegations of the European Union in this meeting. Mr. President, in light of the report attacks resulting in civilian casualties, injuries, and destructions of critical civilian sites and infrastructures in Ukraine, my delegation wishes to emphasize the following points. First, civilian deaths, both intentional and incidental, and instances where conflicting parties put civilians in harm's way by positioning them near military targets, must not be condemned. We urge the warring parties to exercise maximum restraint and avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, the leading causes of civilian casualties in Ukraine. Our position on the humanitarian dimension of this and the other conflicts remain consistent, unchanged, and worth reiterating. 1, the respect for international humanitarian law and international humanitarian rights law, which have protection of civilians as it is cornerstone, must be upheld under any circumstances. B, the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality must be rigorously adhered to and upheld and by all parties, warring parties, must assess whether civilian harm is likely to be excessive compared to the concrete military advantage anticipated. All parties must facilitate full, safe, rapid, and unhindered access for humanitarian personnel and relief to civilians in need. Mr. President, ultimately, ending this conflict is the most crucial step to address its man-made humanitarian consequences. To achieve this, we urge the parties to immediately cease hostilities, resume direct negotiations without preconditions, and engage in a dialogue in good faith. Mr. President, let us seize the opportunity to recommit to the UN as EDO platform to start genuine dialogue towards a negotiated settlement aimed at bringing this conflict to a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace that addresses its root causes and upholds the Charter. I thank you, President.
Я благодарю Мозамбик за их заявление и сейчас предоставляю слово Гаяне.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Acting USG Joyce Msuya and Dr. Volodymyr Jovenir for their briefings. We welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine, Poland, and the European Union in today's meeting. We also extend our condolences to the government and people of Ukraine, including the families and loved ones of those who were killed yesterday, and wish for the speedy and full recovery of those injured. Mr. President, Guyana is extremely alarmed by the continued attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure since the start of this war. The attacks have claimed the lives of more than 11,000 civilians, including women and children, and continue to destroy objects indispensable to their survival. We have repeatedly warned of the devastating consequences of prolonging this war, especially in light of the attacks against hospitals, electricity transmission systems, food ports, gas and water supplies, and a high number of civilian casualties. Mr. President, yesterday's missile strikes were particularly shocking. It was reportedly the largest assault in months, killing over 30 people, including children, and causing extensive damage to the Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital in Kyiv. The airstrike against the hospital turned a large part of what was once a place of sanctuary and healing for so many children into rubble, destroying its toxicology and oncology wards and many other units. We condemn these attacks in the strongest possible terms, stressing that the most vulnerable of civilians, children, were among the hapless victims. What military or other advantage is there to gain from the unconscionable attack against a children's hospital? Mr. President, the devastating accounts of unrelenting violence, death, and destruction must compel us to take urgent action to end this war. Lives, including those of innocent children, cannot continue to be sacrificed at the altar of political brinksmanship. We commend the efforts of those seeking to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict and urge the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict. We also urge them to engage in good faith and to bring an end to the suffering of the millions of men, women, and children who have already paid too high a price in this war. Guyana demands that the parties to the conflict take all necessary measures to protect civilians and critical infrastructure and to comply fully with their obligations under international law, including the United Nations Charter and international humanitarian and human rights law. We stress the need for accountability for the ongoing violations as a critical element on the path to peace. We further call on the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. We echo the acting USG's grave concern, and indeed that of the wider international community, about the increasingly dire humanitarian situation in the country. It is difficult to comprehend the continued denial of access to people in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. We call upon the Russian Federation to grant humanitarian access to all populations in need in the occupied territories. We commend the ongoing response of humanitarian agencies and call on the international community to further support their efforts, including by contributing to the Humanitarian Needs and Response Fund. In closing, Mr. President, I would like to stress the urgency of resolving this conflict through peaceful means. Ghana will continue to support all efforts of the United Nations Secretary General and other partners who have been working diligently to achieve a peaceful and sustainable end to this war. I thank you.
Я благодарю Гаяну за их заявление и предоставляю слово Соединенным Штатам.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Acting Undersecretary General Masuya, for your informative briefing. I also thank Director General Jobner for your briefing and for your courage and for continuing to show up for your patients, even in the direst circumstances. I welcome the participation of Poland, the EU, and particularly Ukraine to this meeting. Colleagues, I'll cut to the chase. We're here today because Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, the current rotational president of the Security Council, attacked a children's hospital. Even uttering that phrase sends a chill down my spine. Russia attacked a children's hospital in broad daylight, killing and injuring children. Chilling. Colleagues, on Monday morning, Russian missiles smashed into civilian targets, including Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital, the largest pediatric facility in Ukraine, and a lifeline for the country's most vulnerable. In the hours since, we've seen images of children bloodied and injured, escaping the damage, of cancer patients just a few years old hooked up to IV drips huddled outside the hospital's bombed-out cancer wing. We've heard the courageous stories of doctors and nurses scrambling to evacuate sick children, many of whom are intubated and on ventilators to safety, of members of the community heroically sifting through the rubble in hopes of finding survivors, of not adding another number to the rising death toll. Director General Jobner has just enhanced our understanding of the impact of this on the 600 patients plus staff in the hospital, including those who were in surgery. Our hearts are with all of those who've lost loved ones, who wonder how their children can get the medicine and the care that they need, who wake up this morning worried about their home, their business, their family will be the next one destroyed by a Russian strike. Because let's be clear, this brutal attack is hardly a standalone incident. In March 2022, Russian airstrikes damaged a maternity and children's hospital in Mariupol. In December 2023, a Russian missile plunged into a medical facility in Dnipro. And I could go on, but the fact is that across the country, hundreds of children have been killed, thousands have been wounded, and millions have been displaced from their homes as Russia continues its campaign of terror in Ukraine. And then there are those children Russia has deported or forcibly transferred, robbing Ukrainian youth of not only their futures, but their very identities. Colleagues, when Putin announced his so-called peace plan last month, I called it what it was, an outrageous attempt to force Ukraine to accept an unjust peace while facing the barrel of a gun. As if there was any doubt that this was the case, yesterday's attack makes abundantly clear Putin is not interested in peace. He's committed to wreaking death and destruction in pursuit of his war of aggression. And of course, Putin hasn't just attacked hospitals. Russia has upped its coordinated attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, taking out over half of the country's power generation. Power plants in Kharkiv are operating at severely reduced capacity due to nearly daily attacks. Tens of thousands have had to evacuate. This is a deliberate and cruel effort to leave millions of Ukrainians without heat this winter. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Russia started this war, and Russia can end it at any time. As my colleague from France stated, Russia cannot win this war. It could choose to withdraw its forces from Ukraine and end the assault on hospitals and power plants. It could halt its campaign of torture and deportation, its pattern of violating international law. It could heed the will of over 140 countries who have repeatedly called for this madness to stop. Until that day, and until the victims of these atrocities have gotten the accountability and justice they deserve, the United States will stand with Ukraine. We will stand with Ukraine in its efforts to defend its borders, and we will stand with Ukraine here in this council. As laid out in last month's Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland, we will support Ukraine's right to self-defense and invest in the country's recovery, reconstruction, reform, and modernization. And we will uphold the principles of the UN Charter, including respect for sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. We encourage every member of this council and every corner of the international community to do exactly the same. Thank you.
Я благодарю Соединенные Штаты за их заявление и предоставляю слово Соединенному Королевству.
I would like to start by thanking Under-Secretary General Masuya and Dr. Zhovnir for their briefings, and I welcome the participation of Ukraine, Poland and the EU in our meeting today. I offer the UK government's deepest condolences to Dr. Zhovnir and the victims of Russia's latest appalling airstrikes across Ukraine, and to their families and their loved ones. Since the 23rd of February 2022, in repeated attacks on Ukraine, Russia has killed Ukrainian children. Russia has maimed and injured Ukrainian children. Russia has abducted Ukrainian children. And yesterday, Russia came back for wounded and sick children in Okhmatdyt hospital. This is cowardly depravity, and this must stop. I visited Okhmatdyt hospital last December. It's become a refuge for children injured in attacks across Ukraine. I saw for myself the dedication of Dr. Zhovnir and his staff and the care they provide. I met two young girls among many who were resolutely learning to walk again with prosthetics. One had been injured in Russia's attack on Kharkiv, the other in Russia's attack against Kramatorsk railway station. Colleagues, intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects constitutes war crimes. The ICC has already issued arrest warrants for the Russian president, former defense minister, the chief of the general staff, and the Commissioner for Children's Rights for suspected war crimes. Since the 23rd of February 2022, Russia has violated the UN Charter and repeatedly breached international humanitarian law. Its conduct is a disgrace to the Security Council and especially to the President's seat. Colleagues, we must join together to condemn Russia's actions and stand foursquare behind the UN Charter and its guarantees of sovereignty and territorial integrity, and behind international law and international humanitarian law. For our part, the UK, together with our partners, will continue to ensure Ukraine is able to defend itself from these barbaric acts of violence, as confirmed by my Defence Secretary this weekend in Odessa, where he announced new military aid for Ukraine's defence. At the NATO summit this week, we will demonstrate our resolve to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. We will also work to ensure accountability and justice for the Ukrainian people. And we will support Ukraine to secure a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. I want to commend the exceptional resilience of the Ukrainian people, and in particular to pay tribute to the Ukrainian emergency services, especially over the last 48 hours. I also express my admiration for the doctors and other hospital workers at Okhmatdyt and for their patients. In conclusion, I call on Russia again to end its aggression against Ukraine and immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its forces from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders and stop killing Ukrainian children. Thank you.
Я благодарю Соединенное Королевство за их заявление и предоставляю слово Японии.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Musuya and Mr. Zovna for their detailed briefings. Today, we have come together once again to confront the grim reality caused by the escalating attacks by Russia across Ukraine. According to the reports, a barrage of Russian missiles across Ukraine caused serious damage and many casualties, including at a pediatric hospital in Kiev, where many young, innocent children are hospitalized. Japan condemns Russia's attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure across Ukraine in the strongest terms. We express our deepest condolences to those who lost their loved ones and hope for the speedy recovery of the injured. In particular, we sincerely wish that the children who should be receiving treatment will get prompt and appropriate care. We are deeply frustrated that we must be once again updated on the numerous and increasing civilian casualties resulting from the clear violation of the UN Charter by a permanent member of the Security Council. Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine has led to the death and injuries of countless innocents, continuing to worsen the humanitarian crisis on the ground. Since the beginning of Russia's aggression, so many children who should be the future of Ukraine and the future of the world have been mercilessly killed and maimed. According to the annual report on children and armed conflict in 2023 alone, the UN verified the killing of 80 children and maiming of over 330 children. It is also recorded that over 200 schools and 90 hospitals were attacked. It is unfathomable that these figures do not represent the whole scale of impact on children. We must never forget child abductions by Russia as well. They should be returned home and be united with their loved ones immediately. My delegation is absolutely enraged by Russia's continuous disregard for international law, including international humanitarian law. Attacks targeted against civilians and civilian objects are clearly prohibited by IHL. The international community will not tolerate impunity for those responsible and perpetrators of violations of IHL, and all other heinous acts must be identified and held accountable. Once again, we reiterate our clear position to urge Russia to cease its aggression and immediately and unconditionally withdraw from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Japan continues to stand with the people of Ukraine. I thank you.
Я благодарю Японию за их заявление. Сейчас я сделаю заявление в качестве представителя Российской Федерации. Я бы хотел начать с выражения благодарности Франции и Эквадору за созыв этого заседания. Как очевидно из выступлений западных коллег, к слову, весьма лаконично, тема якобы российского удара по детской больнице, для обсуждения которой они нас сегодня собрали, явно для них неблагодарна. Да и наверняка они видели многочисленные разборы произошедшего по фото и видео, из которых четко следует, что это была ракета украинской ПВО. Отсюда и чудеса словесной эквилибристики, которые сегодня демонстрируют западные члены Совета Безопасности, любыми словами, любыми способами пытаясь выгородить киевский режим. Для нас же это заседание возможность рассказать правду о произошедшем. Однако правда, как известно, наших западных коллег не интересует, и они в лучших традициях провокаций в Буче или с Мариупольским госпиталем, о котором сегодня упоминалось, пытались выдать желаемое за действительно, осуждая якобы целенаправленный удар ВКС России по детскому медицинскому учреждению. Лукавство подобной тактики видно невооруженным глазом, и это сразу же подметили сами украинцы. Благо видеозаписи попадания по больничному комплексу быстро появились в интернете и перечеркнули все потуги киевских и западных пропагандистов. Вот ссылки на наиболее популярные, наиболее полные публикации. Это QR-код, прошу обратить внимание. А вот что по горячим следам опубликовали украинские телеграм-каналы, остающиеся сейчас единственным источником нецензурируемой украинской властью информации для своих соотечественников. Цитирую. Банковая, офис президента, спустила всем темник публиковать и разгонять только детскую клинику Okhmatdyt, чтобы отвлечь внимание от других прилетов. А там очень интересные объекты, и люди могли задать вопрос властям, почему военные объекты прямо соседничают с жилыми домами и больницами. Б. Попытаться поднять боевой дух армии и народа на основе ненависти к противнику. Мол, бил он целенаправленных детей, хотя все знают, что это упала сбитая ракета. Это цитата. В. Отвлечь массы от ежедневного беспредела власти, коррупции, повышения тарифов, роста цен, роста разочарования масс и так далее. Г. Отвлечь внимание от постоянного отступления ВСУ. Д. Добавить очередную причину для оправдания беспредельной зе-мобилизации. Е. Хайпануть медийно в западной прессе перед саммитом НАТО. Конец цитаты. И вот еще цитата. По удару в больницу Okhmatdyt все ясно. Эта ракета ПВО ВСУ НАСАМ сбилась с пути и влетела в здание возле детского корпуса. Западные средства ПВО также часто ошибаются. Скорее всего, в воздухе она потеряла цель и захватила тепловой сигнал от больницы, перепутав цели. Так же было, когда ПВО ВСУ ударило по Польше и в трактор, убив поляков. От ракеты X-101 было бы намного больше урона у здания, в которое оно попало. Мы постоянно пишем, что ракеты ПВО ВСУ часто сбиваются с пути. Таких трагедий было множество до этого, и Банковая, то есть офис президента, постоянно врала людям, что это русские бьют специально в жилые дома. Банковой необходимо постоянно подогревать ненависть в массах и обосновывать продолжение войны вот такими искусственными трагедиями. Военные даже сами признавали, что многие трагедии – это дело рук их ПВО. Это цитата из украинских пабликов, это не мои слова. Коллеги, теперь я надеюсь, вы понимаете, что сколько бы киевский режим и его западные спонсоры не пытались представить произошедшую трагедию результатом целенаправленного российского удара, даже в глазах простых украинцев эта версия не выдерживает никакой критики. В этих условиях крайне сожалеем, что в грязную пропагандистскую кампанию Киева и его сообщников оказался втянут Совет Безопасности. Хотели бы задать господину Жовнеру вопрос, как он, выйдя на улицу, понял, что больница подверглась именно российскому удару. Кто предоставил ему такие данные, которые противоречат правде и здравому смыслу? Понимает ли он, что если бы это была российская ракета, от здания бы ничего не осталось, и дети, и большинство взрослых погибли бы, они были бы ранены? Но, судя по темному экрану, мы вряд ли услышим ответ на этот вопрос от господина Жовнера. Мы неоднократно говорили, что Россия не наносит удары по гражданским объектам на Украине. Если же говорить об ударах российских ВКС, которые действительно были нанесены по объектам военной промышленности Украины и авиационным базам ВСУ, то одной из целей в Киеве стал Киевский завод имени Артема, одно из крупнейших предприятий концерна «Укроборонпром». Это один из главных производителей авиационных ракет, оружия и боеприпасов, и эта цель, согласно данным объективного контроля и по свидетельствам самих киевлян, была поражена. Поскольку завод находится примерно в 2 километрах от пострадавшей детской больницы Okhmatdyt, есть все основания полагать, что поразившая его ракета украинской ПВО была предназначена именно для перехвата той российской ракеты, которая попала по заводу. Подобных трагедий можно было бы избежать, если бы киевский режим в нарушение норм МГП не размещал бы системы ПВО и тяжелые вооружения в жилых кварталах. Однако на этот момент его западные спонсоры предпочитают закрывать глаза. Не можем также не сказать и о том, что сами украинцы в соцсетях подметили примечательную тенденцию. Трагедия с попаданием ракеты ПВО в детский госпиталь произошла ровно накануне саммита НАТО. Причем это уже 3-й саммит НАТО с начала СВО, и схожие ситуации возникали перед каждым из них. Так было 27 июня 2022 года, когда украинские СМИ сообщили о взрыве в торговом центре в городе Кременчуг Полтавской области, в то время, когда в нем якобы находились сотни человек. В действительности пожар в торговом центре, который не функционировал, произошел в результате детонации хранившихся в соседнем здании поступивших от США и европейских стран боеприпасов. Так было и когда в ночь на 6 июля 2023 года российские ВКС нанесли удар по пунктам временной дислокации ВСУ и иностранных наемников во Львове. Примечательно, что мэр города Львова, Садовый, признал, что жилые дома были повреждены именно обломками ракет ПВО. И во всех случаях эти ситуации максимально обыгрывались главарем киевской клики для того, чтобы выклинчить новое оружие для Украины. Любопытная тенденция, не правда ли? И весьма показательно, что ее подмечают сами украинские информресурсы. Кстати говоря, напрашивается еще один вопрос. И это к словам постпреда Словении о подтвержденных данных удара российской ракетой по госпиталю Okhmatdyt. На размещенных украинскими пользователями интернета видеороликах видно, как по заводу имени Артема одна за другой, без каких-либо помех и повреждений, прилетают 5 ракет ВКС России. Точно так же видно, что без каких-либо повреждений и помех в район детской больницы прилетает одинокая ракета ПВО Украины. ПВО Украины. Ее невозможно ни с чем спутать по четко различаемому характерному оперению и другим характеристикам. Как так получается, что украинское ПВО пропускает все 5 ударов по заводу, но четко бьет по детской больнице? Быть может, представитель киевского режима нам ответит на этот вопрос. Ждем реакции также от норвежских властей, которые, судя по всему, поставили к лике Зеленского эту установку NASAMS. Санкционировали ли они, чтобы она использовалась для удара по детской больнице, а также чтобы в нарушении норм МГП размещалась в жилых кварталах? На этом фоне и в полном соответствии со своими методичками глава Офиса президента Ермак уже успел сделать заявление о невозможности переговоров с Россией. Нет сомнений, что руководство Украины будет использовать сегодняшнюю ситуацию как повод для дальнейшего игнорирования запросов в украинском обществе, да и со стороны всего мирового большинства на поиск мирного решения украинского кризиса. Оно и понятно, ведь при таком сценарии исчезнет необходимость продления военного положения, а это повлечет необходимость проведения выборов. Этого утратившая легитимность киевская клика боится больше всего, осознавая крайне негативное отношение населения к себе. Поэтому и предпочитает приносить в жертву десятки, если не сотни тысяч своих сограждан, отправляемых в бессмысленную мясорубку. Мы же со своей стороны неоднократно выступали за начало переговоров и прекращение боевых действий. Но это должно быть именно прекращение, а не их приостановка, чтобы дать Киеву возможность залезать раны и вооружиться. Кроме того, должны быть устранены первопричины украинского кризиса. Без этого устойчивого и долгосрочного мира не будет. Наши условия для завершения конфликта подробно изложил президент Путин 14 июня на встрече с руководством внешнеполитического ведомства. Ценим инициативы всех государств, которые нацелены на истинное прекращение огня и учет наших законных озабоченностей. Они направлены на продвижение пропагандистских пустышек типа псевдомирной конференции в Швейцарии. А пока Киев и его спонсоры остаются глухими призывом воспользоваться дипломатией, мы будем вынуждены продолжать добиваться принуждения Украины к миру и устранения первопричин нынешней кризисной ситуации военным путем. Я вновь приступаю к обязанностям председателя Совета и сейчас предоставляю слово Украине.
Well, distinguished members of the Security Council, I would like to thank all of you who have given words of support and expressed your sympathy following yesterday's barbaric attack against Ukrainian civilians, including children. I would also like to thank Acting Under-Secretary General Msuya and Mr. Zhovnir for their comprehensive briefings, revealing the dreadful outcomes of the Russian missile strike. I'm sorry to recognize the representative of the terrorist Putin's regime in the chair's seat. It has become a tradition for Russia to mark its presidency in the Council with heinous war crimes and genocidal endeavors. This time is no exception, and the chair's seat is already soaked with blood. Yesterday, Russia deliberately targeted perhaps the most vulnerable and defenseless group in any society: children with cancer and other life-threatening illnesses. Even in times of peace, these children face enormous challenges and require specific support and care. It has always been recognized as one of the most touching manifestations of humanity and empathy to donate and help such children, to ensure they get medical treatment, and to create joyful moments to alleviate their sufferings. The Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital in Kiev, the largest medical center treating young patients with cancer and other life-threatening illnesses, has served this goal and helped thousands of children from across Ukraine and abroad. The director of the Okhmatdyt has just briefed the Council on the unique position of this hospital in the system of medical treatment of children. Yesterday, Russia again showed its repugnant version of empathy toward children by attacking the Okhmatdyt with the Kh-101 cruise missile. That is slide 1. It's analysis of objective monitoring data on the flight trajectory of the cruise missile on July 8 from 9:40 a.m. to 10:40 a.m. The photo shows the trajectory of the missile from the moment it entered the airspace of Ukraine and the moment it struck the hospital building. The video footage clearly testifies that the Okhmatdyt hospital was a deliberate target. The footage captured the moment the Kh-101 missile dived towards the hospital building. Later, the Security Service of Ukraine made public the pictures of the remnants of this missile found on the spot. Slide 2. During the inspection of the scene, the investigators of the Security Service of Ukraine and the National Police found and examined fragments and parts of the air missile that struck the hospital. According to the preliminary assessment of military specialists, the specified objects belong to the parts and components of the Kh-101 strategic air-to-ground cruise missile, which is in service with the Russian army and is used by Russian long-range aviation units. The photo on the right below shows the identified fragment of the casing of the Kh-101 cruise missile with part of the serial number displayed . Slide 3, fragment of the Kh-101 missile under the rubble of the hospital building, part of the missile body. Slide 4, characteristic elements of the Kh-101 missile have been identified and examined. The photo on the left shows a fragment of the wing opening mechanism of the Kh-101 cruise missile. The photo on the right shows a fragment of the Kh-101 cruise missile engine. As a result of the strike, the toxicology ward, where young patients received dialysis, was completely destroyed. Other facilities at the Okhmatdyt, including surgical, medical, diagnostic buildings, trauma, as well as hematology and oncology departments, were damaged. Additionally, the Russian missile damaged the nearby Center for Pediatric Cardiology and Cardiac Surgery, where 3 heart surgeries were underway at the moment of the strike. We have just heard the professional assessments of the long-term consequences for the treatment of hundreds of seriously ill children. These consequences include both physical harm and the stress endured by the patients, as well as the destruction of the medical provision necessary to treat them. Alongside the immediate casualties among the medical personnel and children following the strike, these long-lasting outcomes also constitute a war crime. Even more abhorrent is the fact that the Okhmatdyt hospital was just one of many targets in Russia's heavy missile strike, which hit the cities of Kiev, Kryvyi Rih, Dnipro, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Pokrovsk yesterday. According to information from the Defense Forces of Ukraine, the Russian Federation launched 38 missiles, including Kinzhal air ballistic missile, Iskander-M ballistic missile, Zircon hypersonic cruise missile, KH-101, KH-22, and Caliber cruise missiles, as well as KH-5969 guided aerial missiles. Almost 100 civilian sites were savagely attacked. Medical and educational facilities, residential buildings, business centers. In Kryvyi Rih, 11 people were killed following the attack on the administrative building of a local industrial facility. In Kiev, along with the Okhmatdyt hospital, the list of targets includes a maternity hospital where 9 people were killed, and a residential building where the Russians killed 7 residents, including 4 children. Let us not forget that the pains Russia goes to harm Ukrainian children has been a mainstream aspect of the aggression from the very beginning. The children who Russia cannot abduct and brainwash, Russia kills. Let us not forget that Russia is kept on the list of shame for the crimes its armed forces have committed against children. Let us not forget that the person sitting today at the head of the table represents a wanted criminal suspected of crimes against children and subject to arrest under the ICC warrant. At least 47 people were killed and more than 190 were wounded following yesterday's strike. Putin's envoy employed his usual tactics of denying reality and blaming Ukrainian air defense. I recall clear footage of the Russian missile approaching the hospital, the scale of the destruction, and the eyewitness accounts. His comments about the possibility to destroy it entirely if Russia supposedly hit are just monstrous. Other Russian propagandists, particularly the so-called Z bloggers, have been more open. Z bloggers are administrators of Russian propaganda channels on social media with hundreds of thousands of followers. Given the specifics of their audiences, they, unlike their colleagues from the Russian diplomatic corps, openly explain the rationale behind the Kremlin's bloody actions. One of them, certain Roman Saponkov, openly stated that the strike on the children's hospital in Kiev would benefit Russia, and I quote, "Such attacks might even be beneficial because an average Westerner might finally have a thought, damn, the same could have happened to us. And the children's center in Kiev looks very much like a hospital in Warsaw. Incidents like these might work in our favor." End of quote. They do not even hide that they are deliberately attacking hospitals. That is exactly what Russians regularly did in Syria from 2015. In April 2016, for instance, they attacked the main health care facility for children in the city of Aleppo, killing 24 civilians. It is also telling that in 2020, Russia withdrew from a voluntary UN arrangement aimed at protecting hospitals and humanitarian aid deliveries in Syria. Now they aim to kill Ukrainian children and also to intimidate the countries which demand Russia comply with the UN Charter. The attack on a children's hospital is also an indication of Russia's current unwillingness to engage in a peace process. It is not surprising that Russia persists in rapidly tearing apart the concept of a comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on the UN Charter principles, a concept, I underline, that is at the core of both Ukraine's peace formula and the UNGA resolution ES 11/6 of February 23, 2023. Russia has rejected its responsibility to adhere to the UN Charter and, in fact, demands that the international community acknowledge its right to violate international law. However, the attack on the Children's Hospital is also a manifestation of Russia's deepest contempt for any peace initiatives, regardless of their origin. The Kremlin's moral and managerial degradation has reached such an extent that it does not hesitate to commit crimes that undermine the vision for peace of those countries on which Kremlin now entirely depends. Russia is like cancer, only worse. It will stop killing and expanding violence only when it is incapable of doing so. It is imperative to shoot down Russian missiles. It is imperative to destroy Russian combat aircraft at their bases. Bold steps must be taken to eliminate any security deficit. Currently, the UN membership is actively preparing for the Summit of the Future. We are engaged in active negotiations on the final document with the Declaration on Future Generations as its integral part. The question is, however, what kind of future are we talking about if the murderer feels comfortable sitting knee-deep in children's blood in the chair's seat here? As I said in this chamber in 2022, this war criminal will end up in hell, bypassing purgatory, and his place there is eternal. What matters, however, is how he will be put in the dock before that. I can't stomach the thought of how one can shake his hand and accept a lunch with him paid for with blood money. It is sickening to think of how, in about a week, his depraved boss, Lavrov, will preside over all of you in this chamber and lecture you on multilateralism. How many more Russian crimes will it take for the issue of the presence of the dictatorial Kremlin regime in the Soviet permanent seat to be addressed? What atrocities must be committed to ensure that the aggressor's veto is disregarded and the Security Council is able to respond to Russia's aggression and war crimes? The international community has the necessary capacities to provide the aggressor with proper answers. Answers in the only language that any aggressor understands: strong, resolute, and united actions to defend the Charter, to stop its violations, and to ensure accountability for all crimes, including those committed yesterday. I thank you.
В соответствии с традициями председательства и сугубо в качестве председателя Совета я вынужден поблагодарить Украину за их заявление. Сейчас я предоставляю слово главе делегации Европейского Союза при Организации Объединенных Наций.
President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, and the EFTA countries Iceland, Liechtenstein, as well as Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino, align themselves with this statement. As we heard from USD Msuya and from Dr. Zovnik yesterday, several waves or large-scale Russian missile attacks on Ukrainian cities caused at least 40 civilian deaths, including children, and over 150 injuries. The numbers go up every hour. In Kiev, the Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital was directly hit by a missile, a children's hospital. The images of the aftermath of that attack are devastating. Panicked parents holding their children on the street, doctors and nurses scrambling to provide first aid against the backdrop of destruction. The attacks were immediately and roundly condemned by both Secretary General Guterres and PGA Francis and countless leaders and voices around the world. They are a stark reminder of why the Russian armed forces are listed by the UN as a perpetrator of great violations against children in armed conflict. By targeting Okhmatdyt, a symbol of Ukraine's childcare medicine, Russia once again demonstrates its cruelty and its utter insincerity about peace talks. One can only imagine the further horrors that were averted by the courageous interventions of Ukraine's air defenses. Colleagues, we are confronted with a striking paradox. The member state currently holding the presidency of the UN Security Council, the body responsible for maintaining peace and security, is intensifying, as we speak, attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, including that country's hospitals and power plants. Such systemic airstrikes against Ukraine's civilians and civilian and critical infrastructure violate international humanitarian law and must stop immediately and unconditionally. In a report issued last week, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights extensively documented Russia's targeting of energy infrastructure, as well as its use of so-called double-tap strikes, where it uses high-precision weapons to strike the same location twice within a short interval, causing additional casualties among civilians and first responders. These are the facts. These are the facts. Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable for waging a war of aggression and for other most serious crimes under international law, as well as for the massive damage caused by their war. Later this week, the UN General Assembly will vote on a resolution regarding the threats posed to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and to support the work of the IAEA in ensuring nuclear safety and security in Ukraine. It is the first time in history, that a nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe, has been illegally seized by a foreign aggressor. History matters here. History, including the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, has taught us all the existential importance of nuclear safety and security. Russia's irresponsible actions place all of us at risk. That is why we hope and expect that all UN member states will strongly support this resolution and this initiative for nuclear safety. In closing, I cannot but reaffirm, especially in the aftermath of this inhumane bombings, the EU's unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. The European Union will continue to support both Ukraine and respect for the UN Charter in response to Russia's illegal aggression for as long as it takes. Thank you.
Я благодарю Евросоюз за их заявление и сейчас предоставляю слово Польше.
Distinguished members of the Security Council, let me start by thanking today's briefers for their remarks and testimony. Just over 3 weeks ago in Bürgenstock, Switzerland, countries gathered to look for the path to just peace in Ukraine. The final document of the conference, signed up to today by 90 countries and international organizations, opens with the following sentence: the ongoing war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine continues to cause large-scale human suffering and destruction and to create risks and crises with global repercussions. Only 24 hours ago, the aggressor sent us the latest chilling reminder of how acutely precise these words are. Russia's unprovoked war continues with unprovoked, indiscriminate attacks against the innocent and the most vulnerable. Excellencies, since the launch of its full-scale military invasion in February 2022, Russian forces have targeted the largest Ukrainian nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, the largest Ukrainian water dam in Kakhovka, and now, brazenly enough, they took aim at the largest Ukrainian children's hospital in Kiev, with hundreds of young patients seek relief and comfort. The attack was immediately condemned by numerous world leaders, including my country's highest authorities, which were hosting President Zelensky in Warsaw on this very day. It is very important that we also gathered in this chamber to once again deplore the Russia's atrocities, especially during the month it holds Security Council presidency, and to loudly redeclare that under international humanitarian law, hospitals have special protection. It is important for the world to hear the truth about Russia deliberately creating humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine, but is attacked and moreover using them as a tool of disinformation campaigns that we heard also today. Poland duly notes that the 2023 Secretary General's report on children in armed conflicts for the second consecutive year correctly identifies Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups as a parties that commit grave violations. In Ukraine, Russia not only commits such atrocities attacks as one of the children's hospitals in Kiev, but it continues its disgraceful practice of forcible displacement of Ukrainian children. All this violates international law, including Geneva Convention, Genocide Convention, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it constitutes a war crime for which Russia must be held accountable. Children who remain in Ukraine face the risk of death and loss of health and have very limited opportunities for development and education. And let me be clear, saying so, we have in mind not only Ukraine, but the children in every conflict where children are targeted victims. Excellencies, according to media experts' estimates, Russia spent as much as $250 million on yesterday's missile barrage against targets in several Ukrainian cities. Instead of spending money on treating its own children, Russia prefers to spend hundreds of millions on killing children in Ukraine. And it's not only about Ukraine. The sum of money spent on this one-day attack would be sufficient for building several hospitals in developing countries. Russia's war cost everybody dearly, both in loss of lives and material damage. Distinguished delegates, can you imagine what would be those costs in the case of nuclear disaster? This is why the UN General Assembly will soon vote on the resolution condemning the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which urges Moscow to refrain from its nuclear gamble of illegally occupying Zaporizhia nuclear power plant that puts us all at the great risk. We truly hope that the proposal will garner the broadest possible support, which will underscore our commitment to restoring peace in Ukraine in accordance with the UN Charter and fundamental principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, and will be in line with the declaration of the latest peace summit in Switzerland. Let's save the children from the scourge of war. Thank you.
Я благодарю Польшу за их заявление. Список ораторов исчерпан. Заседание объявляется закрытым.
continue to say that we are the same with Mariupol Hospital, which was mentioned today. Time has passed, and everybody forgot that we replied to that by rejecting the accusations, saying that it happened exactly the other way than they claimed.
Ambassador, the Ukrainian ambassador just showed us multiple photos. With
What would you expect from the Ukrainian ambassador to demonstrate to you? The stray Ukrainian anti-aircraft missile? Of course, they briefly, hurriedly made their version of events with the demonstration of the debris of some Russian rocket. What else can they say? Will they be willing to recognize it was their missile that hit the hospital? And when he accused me of being immoral, saying that the Russian missile would have destroyed the hospital completely, I don't see what immorality he's referring to. Because indeed, if the Russian missile that was targeted to the military object would hit the hospital, then the hospital would be completely destroyed. I mean, I'm not rejoicing at whatever victims or the wounded were in the hospital at the time of a strike. Moreover, that it was the Ukrainians themselves that did it. But you saw that despite the evidence provided to us, 300 people were injured, including 8 children. 2 grown-ups were killed. And I'm not, again, every death is a tragedy, but the scale of destruction is not the one that they're trying to present. And you can see the footage and the photos from the QR code I gave you. I can demonstrate it again, demonstrating how people are gathering around the rubble, strangely passing water through the line, passing the bricks, and looks very ingenious, I would say. I mean, that looks suspicious.
Ambassador, the Saudi Arabia announcement that they would drop European Union bonds if it confiscates Russian assets. Do you have any comment on that?
Not yet. I have not seen the announcement by Saudi Arabia. I was distracted by the meeting. I will study.
Mr. Ambassador, what do you think about the fact that UN Secretary General abruptly accused Russia of hitting the hospital?
Well, you remember I came for a stakeout to discuss the way UN is commenting on the Russian strikes and the Ukrainian strikes, to compare the reaction. And when I visited the Secretary General after that stakeout, I gave him the same quotes that I was reading out to you, telling him that these are clearly double standards. When the Russian territory is hit and the civilian objects are hit, the reaction is very flaccid. But when something happens in Ukraine, the Secretary General and his spokesmen are rushing to accuse and condemn Russia right away.
Ambassador, so to be clear, you're saying that it was an errant rocket of the Ukrainian air
Yes,
defense.
I do. And not just me, but the Ukrainians themselves.
Okay,
Look
so,
at the publics.
But was Russia firing in the area? Because why would the air defense
Russia,
be triggered
yes,
under
indeed.
this
Russia
scenario?
was hitting the factory, one of the largest factory in Ukraine, which produces armaments. That is Artyom, so-called Artyom factory, a very old enterprise, which is 2 kilometers away from this Okhmatdyt hospital in the vicinity, and the Ukrainian air defense was in the area, which again testifies that they are using against the international humanitarian law. They are using civilian quarters, deploying anti-aircraft systems there.
Ambassador, European governments, including the Irish government, have called Russia's bombing of the Children's Hospital a war crime. What is your response to that?
My response to that I gave many times, including at this stakeout, that we have not bombed the Children's Hospital.
And on the Ukrainian ambassador's challenge to the legitimacy of Russia's
Well, that's a perennial thing with the Ukrainian ambassador. He cannot cease referring to it. I just ignore his statements, you know that. Thank you very much.